So now we're going to come to a discussion about dates. We're going to cover the two date data types. There's actually two of them, and that's important because the two types behave slightly differently, and we've got to be aware of them. We're going to get into querying date type columns, and we're going to learn how to manipulate the date components within those data types, how to extract the month, or how to compare the date or even the day of the week. And we're going to cover potential traps when we're working with time components within dates. The data types involved, there's actually two of them. There's date, which you would, that makes perfect sense. If you were to look at the values inside a date column, you would see something like 12/31/2019, which equates to 31st of December 2019. When it's stored in SQL Server, the dates are stored as month, date, and year. Because SQL Server being an American product, it follows the American convention for expressing dates. When we go to query them, there are ways to format the dates to express them in any style that we like. Then there's date time, and the difference between date and date time is that date time can store not only the date, but the time of that date. So it can store an instance of time right down to the thousandth of a second. So for example, you could look at a date time value. It could well be just the date, in which case the 12th of the 31st, 2019, and a bunch of zeros representing no time component at all. Or it could store the date and have the time tacked on the end. In this example down there, 1 minute past 10, 36 seconds, 0.827 seconds. So let's get stuck into querying dates. So let's check out some of these date time data types. As I said, most of the time in SQL Server, it is date time data types that are used and not the date. So we're going to focus most of our work on the date time data type. So we'll start browsing the database in Object Explorer, and we'll go down to good old production.product table. And if we look down here, we've got three date time data types, columns. One is cell start date, the other one is cell end date, and there is modified date. We're going to focus for the time being on cell start date and cell end date. So let's start a new query window, and we'll start off by selecting all the columns in production.product. Okay, so I've selected production.product, I've given it an alias, and as we saw in the previous lesson, it is good practice, and I'll get you to keep doing this for the rest of the course, to prefix your columns in your select clause with the table name or table alias, in this case pp.star, and as is good practice demands, I've ordered it by the prime key. And if we scroll over to the right here, we've got cell start date and cell end date, and we've got a lot of values in cell start date and some values in cell end date. So I tell you what, let's just focus on cell start date. So to make life easy for us, let's put cell start date at the very far left of our select clause. Now, as you can see in the values in cell start date, the data is formatted in Management Studio's results grid like so: year, month, date, and the time component. Now that is really just the way it's displayed. Behind the scenes, it's stored quite independent of locale specific date styles. So when we get into some advanced querying, it's perfectly possible to display that in any style we wish: American style, British style, whatever. So if we could just take that as read, that this is just a style of displaying for the purposes of Management Studio, and we can manipulate that as we want. So let's say we're interested in all the rows where the cell start date is 30th of April 2008. So this is how we do it. Okay, what have I just done? Now we've got our results there, but if we look to the style in which I passed it, I have passed it in American style, being month, date, and the year, essentially because SQL Server is an American product, and in terms of passing values, it follows the American style of expressing dates. But if we just look at the form in which I have passed that value for comparison, it is surrounded by single quotes like a piece of text, but it's got to be formatted in a certain way: month, date, year, separated by forward slashes. So let's say we're not just interested in the cell start dates that are dated 30th of April, but the ones that are dated on or after 30th of April. And that's quite easy to do. We just change the operator from equals to greater than or equals. Now that's a little bit different to the styles we've been dealing with, whereas even though it's treated almost like a text value surrounded by single quotes, we're using arithmetical operators. So let's just run that. And just to make it sort of a little bit easier to interpret, we'll change the order by that. It will order it first by cell date, cell start date, and then by product ID within that section of cell start date, and then it'll kind of make more sense. So we'll just execute that. And if we scroll down, we've got 30th of April there, and then we've got other dates: 31st of May, 2011, 2012, and so on and so forth. Let's say we're not just interested in the ones on or after 30th of April 2008, but those ones up to and including 31st of May 2011. So just those up to 31st of May 2011 and nothing beyond that. Well, that's easy enough to do. We use an AND condition. And as you can see, that probably makes perfect sense. The start date has to be on or after, in other words, after or equal, greater than or equal to. And to get the to date and to include that to date, it's less than or equal to. Let's just execute that and see what happens. But before we do, we'll just check our record numbers. We've got the full set of 504 product records there. And if we execute that, we've got, scroll down, 283. And if we browse our data, there we go, up to 31st of May 2011 and nothing after that. Now, there's another clever way to express those kinds of conditions where we're looking for a value up to another value and including those two values. Where we're trying to get a range between two values, and it's using the keyword between. It's very simple to express, and I'll just demonstrate it. Okay, what have I just typed? Where cell start date between that, and it means exactly what we had before. It gets us everything where it's equal to or greater than that, less than or equal to that, same thing, but it's expressed sort of more in plain English language. And it sort of speaks to how SQL is engineered around plain English language, which makes perfect sense when you read it. Let's execute it and see what the results are. Okay, now if we scroll down again, look at that, we've got 283, that was the same value we had before. And if we scroll up and down, we've got the same sort of range of values, 30th of April 2008 and 31st of May 2011. Now that between operator can be applied to actually any sort of data type, really. Anything that can, any sort of data type that involves sorting. So it includes numbers, a text, and as we've seen, dates. Now let's say that we're interested in the cell start dates that fall within a particular year. Let's say 2013. Now I'm going to show you a slightly long way to do it and then a shorter and more powerful way to do it. The first way, we'll simply go between where the date falls between 1st of January 2013 and 31st of December 2013. And there we go. All those dates that we can see there are in 2013. Well, there is a more powerful way to do it, and that's using a function that extracts a component from the dates. Now, I'm going to get rid of my where clause here and get back to the full set of data, and that'll help me demonstrate things here. So let's say we want to come up with a column that shows the year component of that date. Let's just do that as an exercise. Well, there's a function that does it for us quite simply. So I'm going to start it on a new line here. And the function we're going to call up is datePart. Now, if we look at the metadata there, it's asking for a couple of things: an interval and an actual date or date time value. And you know what? I'm just going to type it and then we'll discuss it. Okay, what have I just written? Date part, and we passed in an actual text literal called year and then the date. So date part can extract any part of a date, that's the second parameter, and that part that it can extract is specified there. It can be the year, the month, the date, the day of the week, and if there's a time component, we'll come to that later on, if there's a time component in there, it can extract any part of those, the minutes, seconds, you name it. So let's just run that query and see what it gets us. Check that out. We've got the year. The 2008 part of that date is expressed in its own column. Now let's just take this opportunity to look at the documentation surrounding the date part function. So I'm just going to go to the official Microsoft developers website about date part, and let's just look at some of the instruction manual surrounding it. It takes two parameters, as I said before, a date part and an actual date. It can actually take a date time, but if we look to the date part's arguments that it can accept, these are the sort of values: the year, the month, day, week, and note that it can accept other abbreviations as well. For example, it can take YYYY instead of the literal word year. And as you can see, it's quite powerful. It can extract any component of a date time, a date or a date time, right down to the millisecond or the nanosecond even. The return type is int. So because it's an int, every one of these things is expressed as a number. For example, the day of the day is expressed as 1 to 31. The week is expressed as 1 to 52. You get the idea. Now, this date part function is going to have to come with a bit of a caveat here. Up until now, all the functions I've shown you are ANSI compliant and they work the same across all platforms, MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server. That's actually not quite true of the date part function, but I'll show you anyway. In SQL Server and Oracle, you have the date part function. It works identically. In MySQL, there is no date part function. The nearest equivalent is the ANSI compliant extract function, which physically works identically. The syntax is slightly different. It works extract the date part from and pass in the date. And there's an example there, year, from, and the date just there. So if MySQL is your platform, you should be using the extract function. Now coming back to a query, I bet you can guess what we're going to have to do next to actually get the records where the year is 2013, and that is take this expression here and build it into a where clause. So let's do that. Okay, let's execute that. And there we go, and we're just limited to the 2013s. Now, the date part function is incredibly powerful in that, let's say, it can solve other problems for us. Let's say we're interested in getting all the dates that have a month of May. Nothing to do with the year, just the month of May. So whether it's May in 2013 or May in 2012, that's the one we want. So let's just start using a month by putting it in its own column and putting month into the where clause and see how it works for us. And there you see it. We've got the month extracted from that 2013 year. Let's just get rid of this where clause so we can see the entire range of dates and years. So let's just take this month expression, build it into the where clause so we can get the months we want. And there we go. There are all the Mays. Month equals 5 in the year 2011, 2012, 2013. You get the idea. So it actually gets us a better result than what we were using before with the between, where we could go from this date to that date to get a range of dates, which isn't going to work here because the selections that we want are actually scattered across a range of many years. So that just demonstrates how powerful date part is. Now, this extracting number parts of a year is fine, but what if we want to create a nicely formatted string of the entire date? say 1st of March 2013, there's a business requirement for it, and we actually want to use the word March, not the number, how can we achieve that? Well, there's a similar function that we can use called date name. So the date name function is pretty much identical to date part, but it returns text instead of a number. It can also return proper names, so it can return, if we pass it a month, request a month out of a date, it'll return the word December instead of the number 12. And the syntax is identical in that it is the date name, the part that we're asking for, and the date. So let's go right ahead and use date name to extract the month name from the date. And there you go. That's the month expressed as the actual name, May. You know what? It'll probably make more sense if we get rid of this where clause here so we can see all the dates. There we go. We've got April's, May's, and so on and so forth. Now let's apply that to the rest of the date and get strings for the other components, day and year. Okay, and let's see what that gets us. How about that? Now I've also I've got the day here twice. I've got it once expressed using the component day, which gets you the number, and the weekday, actual name is in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday here. So we can use all these components to construct a string that is Wednesday, 30 April 2008, and so on and so forth. So let's give that a go. And there we go, check that out. That is a fully formatted date, Wednesday 30th of April 2008, and changes accordingly. That is a pretty powerful usage of date name. Feel free to save this file for later reference. We'll just go File, Save As, and save it anywhere you like. Let's just call it dates.sql. Now, for the next lesson, let's just clear all these expressions. And we're going to select at the far left here the column modified date that is way over here on the right. So we're going to do some stuff involving that. And while we're here, we'll use modified date in our order by clause. And let's just see what's in there. Well, modified date is actually the same data type as the cell date that we've been working with so far. The only difference is with the data, because remember, they are both date time. They are capable of storing not just the date, but the time as well. And that's exactly what they've done with modified date here. Okay, so let's just say we're interested in getting all of the records where the modified date is just that, 8th of the 2nd, 2014. Let's just give it a go. Right, now you would think that would work because we've got 8th of February, that's 8th of February there, 8th of February 2014. You would think that would get us pretty much all these rows here, but let's see what happens. No, it doesn't. It doesn't get us anything. Why? Because, and you know what, I'm just going to comment out that where clause and get us our records back. Because that's not 8th of February 2014, it's 8th of February and 10 o'clock and 1 minute and 36.027 seconds. Now, that's a bit of an issue. Supposing, do we have to get all these times and what have you? Well, we don't want to, because I can see what's happened. The application is obviously updated, is inserting the date and time in there, and you could have some wildly varying times. You may have 8th of the 2nd, 2014, and 10:01 and 11:06. Do we have to literally query for all of them? Well, no, we don't. There's a bit of a trick to get around this, and it involves the function that we learned earlier in the course called cast. So this is how we get around something like this. Now, bear in mind that, as I explained, there are two data types. There's date time, which we're seeing here, and then there's date. And date is only capable of containing a date, no time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take modified date and we're going to cast it from a date time into a plain date. And this is how we do it. Well, first let's just comment out our where clause there and get all our values back. But this is how we're going to create this casted column. Okay, it is a date as opposed to a date time, but it is just the date component. So I think you can see where I'm going here. We can build that expression into our where clause and get what we want. And there you go. Now I'm going to introduce you to another date related function which is extremely powerful, which can get you today's date. And I'm going to show you how to do it. And it's called getDate. And I've called it today, and there we go. It's 3rd of June 2020, that's today. And the time here in Australia, in Melbourne, 14:20 and 41 seconds. And yeah. Now there's a couple of special things about the getDate function. It doesn't accept any parameters, so it spits something out even when we don't put anything in. And the other special thing about it is that it is non-deterministic. Now, a deterministic function is one that always returns the same value if you put in the same inputs. A non-deterministic function is one that doesn't always return the same value if you put in the same inputs. In the case of getDate, well, it doesn't accept any inputs, but basically what that means is if we were to run it at one time, we would get one value, and if we run it at another time, we get a completely different value all by itself. So for example, if I were to run this again, how about that? I get a different value because it's 4 minutes later. So just a bit of trivia there, just to make you aware of it. Now I'll just get you to watch this exercise and don't necessarily shadow me, because this involves some data that I've specifically modified in this table which will not exist in your AdventureWorks. So look, I'm just going to get rid of my where clause there. Okay, now, with the modified date of this one single record, I've changed it to today's date. Well, just the date component, I've left the time by itself. Now, let's say that I want to write a report to get me all the dates that have been modified today. Now, to get today's date, as we've said, it's getDate. So you might think that we should do it like this, where the modified date equals today, and you might think that would work, and we would get product idea number 1 returned, but let's see. No, we don't get anything. Why? And I'll just deactivate my where clause there, because it's this time factor. There's a time factor in there, and there is a time factor in today's date, and they're not going to match up. So how do we do that? Well, we can do the cast thing again. So let's do that. And there we go. Now I could actually get, you know what, I'll just cast that today expression column as a date so that sort of makes more sense. And you can see what's happening. That has been matched with, effectively with that casted version, and the two match up. So that is a very, very important factor that you've got to consider when we're using today's date. Today's date is not just the date, it's the time, and if we do want the date, just the date for comparison, or perhaps to drop on a report, then you should cast it like so. Now I'm going to have to just get you to watch this. You won't be able to participate because this involves using a record with a cell start date value that I've deliberately manipulated specifically for this lesson. I've changed that to 4th of June 2020, which is tomorrow's date. And let's say the exercise is I want to develop a query that will return records where cell start date is dated tomorrow. That's tomorrow, as in the relative tomorrow, as in the day after today, whatever today may be. So let's say we're developing this query that may be run tomorrow or the day after or next week, and we want to always return records that are dated that date, today's date, plus 1 day. So how do we do that? Well, let's just put getDate into the select clause. There we go, there's today's date. Now, you might think that we should just simply build it into the where clause. Well, I'll bet you that's not going to work, and it's pretty obvious why, because if you compare that to that, you're going to have the time component. Correct, it doesn't. So what we need to do is eliminate the time component by casting this as date instead of date time like we did before. And you know what? I'll just comment out my where clause. Great, so that is now a date only, and let's compare it to cell start date. And of course that's still not going to work because that's dated today, that's dated tomorrow, and the two don't compare. So how can we make this compare? Well, basically we have to manipulate it using a function called dateAdd. And dateAdd can allow us to take a date and move it a certain number of units, be it months, days, years. It's very flexible. Move it a certain number of units of a component into the future or to the past, and I'll just jump straight in and do it. So, I'm going to comment that out so we can get the full table. And I'm going to go over here, and on its own line, I'm going to use the dateAdd function. Now, a bit of metadata has come up there, and the first one that it's prompting us for is what is the interval? In other words, what is the component of the date that we're going to manipulate? Well, that is the day. I'll put that in lowercase. The second one that we're being prompted for is what is the amount that we're incrementing or decrementing, and in this case it's 1. And lastly, what is the actual date that you want us to mess around with? Well, it's cell start date. So let's just put that in, and we'll call that expression as future, I'll make that caps. And let's just see what happens. Okay, what's happened? Well, it's cell start date, and it's increased it by 1 day. It was the 4th of June, it's now the 5th of June. You know what, let's just have some fun with this, and let's just make that a year instead. Oh, look at that. That was 4th of June 2020, now it's 21, and basically all of the components that we saw in date part and date name, any one of those, day, year, month, you can plug that into dateAdd and manipulate that particular part. So let's just put that back to day, and we're going to turn that into a -1, which is perfectly legitimate, and I'll change the expression name to past date. Okay, check that out. It's taken the 4th of June and it's brought it back to 3rd of June. Now I reckon we can put that into our where clause and we'll get returned back the data we want. And hey presto, there you go. Now I'd also recommend investigating the dateDiff function, which is kind of very similar to dateAdd, because while dateAdd returns a date that is manipulated, this just takes 2 dates and gets the difference between the two. So one reports a difference and the other one applies a difference. So dateDiff asks for, if we go down here, the date part, such as months, days, years, the date that you're starting the account from and the end date, and you could get compare 2 dates and find out what is the number of days between those 2 dates or the number of months between those 2 dates. It's very, very powerful, so I'd recommend having a look at that. So let's just recap everything we've covered here in dates, which was fairly substantial. We talked about comparing date ranges using greater than or less than and using the between operator. We talked about the date part function, which can extract any part of a date and the output is in a number. And we can use date name for extracting the text part of a date, such as the day of the week or the month. We talked about casting date times into a date for purposes of comparison or for returning and printing just a date on its own. We discussed the getDate function to get today's date. And lastly, we examined the dateAdd function, which can take a date, manipulate it by forwarding it in the future or past, any component, and dateDiff, very similar, except it calculates a difference. And it's time for our next assignment. So download assignment3.zip, and inside you will find the business requirements in assignment3.pdf, and I've supplied a suggested solution in the file assignment3suggestedsolution.sql, and the results from that are in assignment3results.xlsx.